coming in, and we wanted to make sure there were plenty of chairs. So sometimes having too many chairs makes it isn't a good feel. So hope that you don't feel that.
I'm used to it.
So we have the great fortune of having Bishop Jeff with us here this morning. And how many of you were at 8:30? Got to hear him preach. I know some of our choir members will be at the next service, so you get to sleep in today a little bit, so that's good. So, yeah, it was a wonderful sermon. So thank you so much for being here. And we even had him at the 7:30, so that's commitment, right? But just wanted to give you a little bit of Bishop Jeff's background. This is from our Synod's website. He became bishop in 2010 on February 1st, and coming from the Racine area, last at that was at Holy Communion Lutheran in Racine, and you were a senior pastor there. How long?
18 years.
18 years. So that's great. It's a good number. That's how long I've been doing things. Originally from Billings, Montana, and kind of brings a Billings, Montana flavor to things. I know a lot of your ministry is kind of an outdoor ministry. Canoeing in the Boundary Waters is one of his loves. And has anyone been to the big camp? Now I'm drawing a blank on the name. Boundary Waters Wilderness Canoe Base. Anybody been there before? It's a wonderful place, part of our ministry in the ELCA. But so that's something very special. Started in Texas was his first call at Zion Lutheran. How do you say it? Cuero? Cuero. That's got a good Spanish flavor to it. And of course, Spanish is one of my native languages. And then took a call at Ascension Lutheran in Milwaukee. That's where our Synod's headquarters are. So how many of you are familiar with Ascension? And that's partly where you really were able to serve in speaking Spanish and with the Spanish ministry there. And so are you fluent completely in Spanish?
See.
We will never know. So anyway, without further ado, Bishop Jeff Barrow.
Thank you. It is really nice to be here. And truthfully, when I interviewed at Ascension Lutheran Church in 1980, I think it was, there was an all-Anglo call committee of about 15 people, and one of them said, "Do you speak Spanish?" And I said, "Sí." So he just checked it off and he called me. So it's really a privilege to be here. Since there's still few enough people, very quickly, tell me your name, why you came this morning, and if there's anything you'd like to cover this morning. Start with this shy young woman over here.
I'm Elise, and I'm here because Bishop Jeff and I have gone on trips together. So he has lots to say, and I like to listen.
I'm here because I'm here.
Oh, yeah. Can you score me a couple tickets to the Brown game?
No, the Brown.
Yeah, can you score a couple tickets? I'll go.
Get me down in time for the game.
Thank you.
I'm Leslie, and I'm here because I want to know what's going on in general. Nothing specific.
Thank you.
Well, I'm Vince. I'm here because I've heard you speak before, and I always learn something new. But I'd like to hear anything about the 52306 program.
So,
No. 52306 zip code program.
oh, is it the one on the north side? Oh, yeah, I know what that is. It's one of, oh.
My name is Lorna, and like Vince, I always learn something when I'm in your presence.
My name is Jeff Colco. I'm a 30-year Milwaukee Public School teacher just starting ministry, college ministry.
Right.
Yes.
My name is PJ Lin. I'm here because I like to listen to you.
Thank you.
I'm Diane, and I'm fairly new to the Milwaukee area, so I just like to hear
Okay.
general information.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm Lynn Thomas, and I'm here just to learn more about what's going on.
I'm Danny Thomas, same thing.
Okay.
Just follow her.
Thank you.
I'm Dave, and I like to stick my nose in everything.
I'm Doug Kreckling, just want to learn more about what's going on in the Synod.
Do you have relatives that are received?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm in the community.
Yeah.
And Noble also.
Oh, that's right. That's what
Mike Gifford, I'm just here for a general update.
Corey Olson, just to learn more about what's going on in the Synod.
Okay.
Myron Olson, I want to find out when you're going to get us a new pastor.
Thank you.
I'm Judy, and I'm just want an update, I guess,
Okay.
on what's going on.
Okay, thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to be here, really.
Where's Jim? You gotta
Oh.
hear from Jim.
Jim Engelmeyer, just an update from me too.
Oh, okay. What's the one?
Here's somebody that speaks Spanish.
Un poquito.
We're just saying who we are and why we came this morning.
I'm Darla Hyam, just a member of the church and interested.
Okay.
I'm Jane Sandstrom, and I'm always coming for these things.
Thank you. All right. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. Let me start with just a brief introduction of myself. What Chris told you in my brief resume, I saw my picture, it's 5 years younger than I am today, so you can keep that. But I did grow up in Montana. When I grew up there, I was in the old ALC, so we didn't call it a synod, we called it a district. We didn't call it a bishop, we called it a district president. And the nicest thing was, the office was in Great Falls, which is about 200 miles from everywhere, and that was just fine. So I say this pretty often. I love the large church. I found that it's so important to be connected together. But synodically, I think our purpose as a synod is to empower congregations and raise up leaders. And that's how our synod staff talks very clearly, that we're here to build strong congregations and build strong leaders. And that's what connects us together. And it's not because the big church isn't important, it is. But if you think about congregations and the ministry that happens there, it's sort of like the cell for mission. That's where most of us gather to hear the word. That's where we receive the sacrament of forgiveness. And it's from those congregations that we're sent into the world to be little Christ. And so sometimes to the chagrin of others, I say, you have a congregationalist at heart. Who's your bishop? And that's okay. That's okay. But that's why I understand the synod existing. At the same time, as you kind of look at the synod as a flyover of the church, I see so many isolated parishes today. And I see so many isolated pastors particularly, that I'm glad we have this thing called the synod that reminds us that there's one body that we're connected to. It is actually a privilege for me to go back to Ascension Lutheran Church, where I served in the 80s. I was there when they moved the synod office there. But every morning I look up at the ceiling, because I'm just about below my old office, and you see how far you really came in 30 years. The other thing is, and I say this pretty often, is I go amazed every day. I think about that wonderful congregation, and I think of all the people who have died since I was there. But I'm even more surprised by all the people who are still living. All these people who I thought were really old, like 60 or something when I was there 30 years ago, are still coming to that place. And some of them, in their 80s and 90s, are offering their best gifts to the church they've ever offered. And so that's a real wonderful reminder to me of who we are. So let me say a couple things. Myron, your question. You are in a call process right now. How many of you are getting frustrated at this point? Yeah, I would be too. It's about time. We have, I think we've had a number of really wonderful candidates that you've talked to already. I will say this, one of the hardest positions to fill is that position called associate pastor, and which really surprises me. I think there's some just misinformation that comes that pastors think if they're on their own, they have more freedom, more authority. I look at a staff like this and I think, man, you have high expectations and high support here. You have resources to work with. You have a wonderful team. And so I've encouraged your pastors and your call committee to wait if necessary for the right candidate. And I think that's much better. But it is kind of a unique slot to slide into. And the other thing is, I think St. Matthew's, that I really do consider one of the top churches in the country. That you are looking for someone who is an associate pastor with lead pastor capabilities. Okay. And so that's, I won't tell you when that's gonna get solved. One of my first mistakes I made was I told the congregation in Kenosha, it was, I think, late January, early February. I said, oh, I think you can have a new pastor by Easter. And so in all those meetings between February and November, when they finally issued a call, someone reminded me I had said that. We really believe that this process is up to that all the Synod can do is give you names that are worth interviewing. And we don't, one of our commitments is we don't just pass our orneriest, most hard-to-place pastor in naming the congregation. We actually want somebody that's going to be a good fit here. And then it's up to you and the Holy Spirit to determine it. And so I think there continue to be some fine names that are coming across the wire. So that's about all I can say. But I think
Can you give us a little insight into the scope of this search? You got committed to Synod. What's the scope?
Yeah. No, actually,
church-wide.
What I tell congregations when I go, and let's face it, every congregation wants a new pastor 7 days after their old beloved pastor leaves. What I say is you want to be able to tell your story, but there are 10,000 ELCA clergy. If you have the time and the money, interview every last one of them, I don't care. We're there to help you narrow the scope. And so we do have some names that are in the pool of mobility, but again, we're looking at what you're asking for and who might fit that. There are often some budget constraints as we look at that we have a range, and so you have to have somebody that's in that range, or you have to go back to the congregation and say, you may have to shoot a little higher to get the person you're asking for. But those are all things that we talk about. But what's happened in the last 3 years, really, we've gone to a national registry, and so just with the touch of a button, instead of sending paperwork to one synod, it goes to the national church, and people can request maybe to a region. And so we get a lot more good, they're called RLPs, roster leader profiles. We get a number of good ones in all the time. Then we have to filter through them and think, why did they come to us? Are they really interested in us? And then again, we have to both look at tenure. Does this fit within the guidelines that the congregation has laid out for us? Frankly, I see a lot of wonderful RLPs from 25 and 30-year veterans who are at 55 and 60 are saying, I want to do my best thing for the church. I'm not just going to slide into retirement. But they are also often higher up on the pay scale, and so it gets difficult to find a placement for them. And so, so we look at all those things, and then I encourage you guys. Where did you publish, Chris? You
The Lutheran and Christian Century.
Yeah, and I thought that St. Matthew's had a compelling story to tell, and so I don't know what kind of responses come from that. But I always ask in those ads is that you make sure they work through the Synod office, because from Synod to Synod, that's the one place we have to sort out baggage. And so if somebody has something in their past that we need to know about, Synod to Synod, we check that out. And so that's important that they work through that. But otherwise, I think it will happen. So it's a good question. Thank you. What else would you like to know?
I came in late, so I don't know if this was discussed earlier. There used to be a written publication called the 1212, a newsletter type thing. Is there any electronic such publication coming out of the
Yeah, we do have a weekly update on our website, and then we have a publication that does go out. It's all electronic now. Very rarely do we send out snail mail anymore, just for environmental stewardship mostly. We did just have a guy from the Lutheran magazine come. How many of you get the Lutheran? Yeah, a handful. They have encouraged us to put a synod update in the Lutheran, and we're thinking we'll probably do that in the next month. So we do get a handful of requests for something you can hold in your hand. There's something to like about that, but it's once you've crossed that barrier to electronic, you pause before you go back, because environmentally it is a challenge. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Just, forgive my ignorance. When I'm thinking, I'm wondering how the process goes as far as, for instance, let me give it. Chris has a real strong techno background, and he has expanded, even in the sermons, some of the visuals. I would assume that maybe a younger pastor would benefit by his experience in that regard, as well as some of the other strengths that he has. I'm wondering kind of how the Synod goes about looking at stuff like that.
In terms of calling a pastor?
Yeah, in terms of a calling.
Yeah, and again, my advice to St. Matthew's, and let's face it, I have a great personal interest in this. You're the leading support in synodical benevolence. I have no interest at all in sticking somebody that's hard to live with here. Let's be clear about how we operate. And so I've even probably told Chris and Margaret to hold out for the right person. But I think that is true. I think just generally, and I don't know if you came in when I said that, is that for some reason an associate pastor in a large church is a little bit trickier to fill than I ever thought it would be. I know Steve Samuelson down in at Mount Pleasant in Racine had that. He waited longer than he expected. And I really believe you get more love and support in a church like this than you would in a parish on your own. But there's always these horror stories about the mean old Grinch of a senior pastor. That's
He's old.
See, I had that title. I had a wonderful colleague, and we really functioned as co-pastors. But as senior pastor, I try to remind him every once in a while and so I said, the only thing I could tell about having the title senior is how many people expect you to kind of be an ass. And how easy it is to live up to their expectations. I think you have a marvelous lead pastor now, and I think it's not the worst to have been associate in this place because you understand how important each position is. And from the beginning, I thought this place, everybody on this team supports each other, and everybody has their own space that they operate in, and that's a good thing. So I think that's fine, but people don't know Chris until they meet him. And so that's kind of the popular thing, is people are a little bit trepidatious about coming to the staff.
On the other hand, from the congregation's point of view, I guess, we're concerned about having exhaustive pastors.
That's why I asked at the beginning, are you getting frustrated? I would hope this would go very quickly now. But it's got to be a match, and it's got to be the call committee, and it's got to be the rest of the staff, and we trust that the Holy Spirit still has a hand in this, and I think.
Holy Spirit needs to get his act
I was just going to say how easy it is to flip back into male language when we talk about God. Thank you. We're getting anxious too, and we just met with Chris and Margaret, and we did have the discussion. There were kind of financial parameters, and we saw some good candidates that were kind of outside of those. And we said the congregation may have to consider, do you want to stretch a little bit? And I think that's one of the things. But we're very anxious to get this position filled.
Does it seem that more pastors are requesting solo churches? Because I'm on the call committee, and a fair amount of the candidates wanted a solo position.
Yeah, I think that's what I started with. I think in people's minds, being solo seems like it has more freedom.
Is that a new thing though? Are there more of them seeking that?
Yeah, no, yeah, I think in some ways, for some it is. I think there was one that I really liked that was interviewed here who had been an associate, and I think maybe felt it was time to bloom a little bit on their own. And let's face it, there are some limitations of associates. I was at Ascension Lutheran Church when I remember the annual meeting where the senior pastor gave the report. And then the president of the council turned to the two associates and said, "And Dave and Jeff, you don't have anything to add, do you?" Oh, I think we're beyond that day, and I certainly don't see that as the culture of St. Matthew's. But that's still kind of the image people have in their minds. Yes, sir.
Is there any possibility of looking for two pastors? While you're going through this sifting and looking for another pastor as a first assistant, I would say, look for another, because Pastor Margaret won't be here that many more years either. And if you get one and you just get going, and Pastor Margaret decides to retire, do you want to go through this whole process, or can you find someone in here that one is better than the other per se, maybe age, or a younger person that would like to become involved in another step?
I would love to do that from a synodical standpoint. We'd have to begin with your church council and your finance committee and say, can we take 3.5 pastors for the next number of years? And I'm guessing what the answer might be to that. But that's okay. And we do talent scout a little bit as a synod and look. And so if I see somebody that I really like, I'll call that church and say, I think we got somebody that you ought to interview. And and my own beloved Holy Communion in Racine, as a bishop, you love them metal. They drove me crazy because they let some names slip by when I thought they were ready to go, and I don't know what their call committee was thinking. That's why they keep you out of your old parish. And so, and the end result is they waited about 9 months longer than I thought they needed to, but they got an outstanding second pastor. So I think that's kind of where we're at. We're all getting a little anxious, aren't we, Chris? I would say that. Yeah, how are you? Sure.
Could you specifically comment on what resources you've dedicated at the Synod and to this search, and also talk about procedurally? I mean, are we an agenda item on your staff meeting? I mean, what's the action being taken at the Synod specifically to address
Thank
this?
you. Well, we have Chuck Brumman he's now going to share that job with another pastor who's coming up, but we have a full-time equivalent dedicated to what's called Director of Rostered Leaders. And so his job is to screen through all those RLPs that come through. If he sees anything that's interesting, he'll come to my office and say, I think we need to invite this person in. And we do first screen them either by Skype or by actual meeting to make sure that there's some kind of prospect that we think is going to work. And so we just interviewed 3 last week and another 3, I think, next week, or Thanksgiving, maybe it's the week after. So we do that, and Chuck is really good at going through those RLPs. But then every Wednesday at staff meeting, the first hour is dedicated to mobility. And so we look at every congregation that's in any kind of transition. They're usually about 25 to 30 in some phase of that. And we go through each one of them and say, where are we at? What do we need to do? Do we make a call to expedite this? Or are they kind of, we know where they're at. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah.
My dad, who was a pastor, used to say, he who tooteth not his own horn, his horn shall not be tooted. So I hope that you will say in that meeting that St. Matthew's is a place where a pastor can come and do all kinds of things, not necessarily what's going on here right now, because the ideas are all over the place, and we do all kinds. Our whole meal program just grew.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell. I do tell the prospective candidates exactly what I said early this morning, what I said on your tape, that in my mind, St. Matthew's does more with less fanfare than any church I've ever been at. And I mean that in terms of your leadership in the Synod, that when you look at our global partners that I think really fuel the discipleship in our Synod, St. Matthew's is at the forefront on both Tanzania and El Salvador, in a good way. And you know, some churches don't play as well as others. I think you play very well. I look at your connection with your partners in the city, Reformation and Cross, and is there another one? And then I look at this marvelous food program. What's not to love about that? And certainly we, and then the other one is that I do assure people that I think the culture here among the pastors is that they are mutually supportive. And so even though Gary Erickson came right after Jesus and the 12 disciples and was a tremendous figure, really was, I always thought that he, one of his strengths was he liked to surround himself with capable people. There's senior pastors who don't do that. They like people they can control. I never felt that. And I think that's the culture that you inherited. And so when Gary told me he was retiring, I kind of did my own survey of just to see how I thought the staff was working. I think if somebody in this room got sick and any three of those would have showed up, you would have thought, I did not get cheated.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a good thing, and I think that's a great story to tell. That's why I encouraged you to put an ad in the Lutheran, and you did in Christian Center in your own, because I really think there's a lot to tell about this congregation.
On the, kind of piggybacking Thad's comment about resources, is there, like in the professional business world, there are recruiters out there, you know, banging on doors and making phone calls if they want an IT person or they want a middle manager or an executive. Is there a resource available to the synodical leadership or to individual churches that they could tap into and maybe turn some rocks over? I know it's maybe some of the information isn't flowing into the synod because somebody didn't fill out the paperwork, but maybe there's somebody out there looking who's saying, geez, I didn't even know this existed. You know, is there something outside the door?
It's almost always within the synod that happens. We do have amongst bishops, we'll have people post on the bishops listserv saying, I got this really special place that needs filling. Anybody got any folks? And we're very supportive of each other. There's a part of you that pauses and says, I don't want to send my best pastors outside of the synod. The one who's most candid about that is Peter Rognes, by the way. But the other part is, I think Chris called or emailed the National Church asking for availability of all the candidates, and that gets a little trickier. So I think they held them up a little bit. But as a synod staff, we do. I usually think myself and the role that I play is, my first thought is not who's available, but who would fit well here. And so we do make some calls just to see if people are looking to move or not. So.
Which seminaries do we typically, for our synod, what are we pulling from?
What are we pulling from? Our relationship as a synod is with Wartburg and LSTC. But we get candidates from all over. For first call candidates, they have what's called the Great Draft. The biggest one is in the spring. And there, they first assign the candidates to regions. And so Region 5, which for us is all of Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa, we get a pool of candidates, and that's the first division. And it's done because there's a thing at seminary that's called, you need to be called to the whole church. And so in order to make sure that happens, first they divide regionally, and then they divide up within the region. So we draw from all of the seminaries, really. More likely LSTC, Warburg, and Luther for our synod, but the draft can include any of them. These are great questions, by the way.
I wasn't here in the beginning, maybe you covered this. How many churches are there in our synod, and approximately how many members, and approximately how many people left after the social statement?
Oh, thank you. Well, we're on like our 20th social statement, but I have a guess as to what you're talking about. Okay. There are 135 congregations in our synod. When I was elected, the number was 91,000. I don't know what your role is at St. Matthew's. What you say you're?
About 1850.
Is that?
How many?
About 1850.
And is that
members
accurate?
attendance?
It's baptized members.
Baptized.
Is that accurate?
Yep, we clear the rolls every year.
Okay, well, you're better than most, and so what that reflects, I don't know. I do say this, I will be the bishop who retired the all-star team. you know, there were a bunch of Gary Ericksons left in the last few years. And also one that probably closed congregations. And that's just because of where the church is at today. So sometimes I think there are 135 churches. I love every one of them. I'm privileged to go into every one of them. But I also am very aware that probably the growth in the ELCA will come from about a third of them. And that's just my statistic, but you can think through, and I always use Racine, where I live, as the best example. There are 15 ELCA churches in a town of 75,000. 10 of them are in the same, probably 2 square miles. When I came over 20 years ago to Racine, most of them had multiple pastors. Today, most of them have less than full-time. And it just is that community has aged and changed. Everybody's not Danish. Everybody doesn't walk to church. But you are still left with all these marvelous edifices. And I call it the land of the 57 Buick. They're all pretty, but how do you keep them all running at once? And I've seen the aging in those congregations, and it's just, it's hard even to justify when you have congregations that are 4 and 5 blocks from each other, and they're all big, and they all have old boilers and old roofs, to say that they're going to be there in the same way that they were in the 50s. And so so we have 5 congregations in Racine in very serious discussion about what's next for us. They are finally looking at how to do things in merger or 2-point parishes, and I think that it's long overdue that we address that. So, but again, let me go back to that third, and that's a good. If you took a third of the congregations in our synod, and I think St. Matthew's would still be on the list, and you projected what would the ELCA look like in 25 years, I think that's a great church, and that can still be a great church. It's just that we have all these aging churches that are 5 and 6 blocks from each other often, that it's hard to, I think that's where the pain comes in, as a whole generation has kind of passed away now. That's about as brutally honest as I can be, but I say that everywhere. Well, it's time we started naming that. And so I went to Racine, I think it was 2 years ago, and I have my snitches, and somebody says, the word is out, the bishop is trying to close churches. I'm not Jeff anymore, I'm the bishop now, the bishop. And so I started and I said, this is what I heard. I said, first I used to be the ringleader of this group, now I'm the outsider. I said, I've heard that you're worried that I'm trying to close churches. And I said, we've been closing these churches for the last 30 years, and it's about time we said that together. And here's what happened, is about, long before I was bishop, but I'd say about 10 years ago, talk like that was not just for clergy discussion around coffee. I heard the key lay leaders in those congregations, as that great generation that Tom Brokaw talks about began to move on. I heard key lay leaders say, you know what, you hear this about, I'm going to be the one when they close the doors, it'll still be here. She said, I don't want that. There's got to be something more. And so that's when the lay people in Racine, and that's a good microcosm for what's happening all over, said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so what I encourage congregations to do is to look at your congregations for their asset value rather than for what's missing. And think of this, is that most people look at their church, the one where they may have been baptized, confirmed, where their parents married, where their parents may have been buried from. And there's this wonderful place that is so dear to your heart. but you tend to look at, oh my goodness, what would it take to fix the roof? And can we get through this winter with the old boiler? And that's how we tend to think about churches rather than what's the asset value of this church. And so I challenge every church that I go to every year, once a year, just matter of routine. You should look at three things. First of all, what is your building insured for? Does anybody know that?
5 million.
5 million? You better sit down with Church Mutual. But that's fine. Then you think, if we made the outlandish decision to sell this church, what would we list it for? And then, if we had enough crazy people to say, let's do it, what could you actually sell it for? And there are realtors that can tell you that pretty much. Woody Jarvis, who belongs to Mount Carmel, has been on the money almost every time. But then you sit down and say, okay, it's insured for $5 million. We probably listed for that. Anybody want to buy this church for $5 million? Yeah. And then what could you actually sell it for? And then say, okay, if we could sell it for $3 million, just because somebody thought it was pretty and it's close to downtown Wauwatosa. I think you'd get more than that, by the way. But if we could sell it for that, what would we do with the money?
We'd have to build another church.
You wouldn't necessarily have to. That's what happened at Pentecost when they realized they were so far in the well they couldn't recover. It was one of the most painful discussions I've ever been on. But when they realized that they were going to have to sell that property, I said, what would you do with it? There was an older woman who said, I would spend it all on kids in the neighborhood. And the whole discussion changed. And so let me fast forward to your annual meeting. I'm like 100% sure you're not going to sell this church. I'm like 100% sure. But I think what it does, it invites you to think, what's our mission again in the world? And most of our churches are going to say, of course we do that. But I think as churches get more fragile, and we have some beautiful churches. Let me use Messiah and Racine as an example. There are 50 people left in that church. They are all wonderful. I've worshiped with them. They all look like my parents and grandparents. I think the average age is about 70. They had a funeral in their church and every last member came to it. It was beautiful. They have an interim pastor now for 5 years who takes care of them well. But as you project to the future, all I've said to churches like that is, we will walk with you to the end of the road, but please do not spend your inheritance on your own life support. Because there are churches that begin to borrow against the property, and there's one in our synod that finally sold it to pay off the debt, and there was nothing left. I think that someday Messiah, after all those people are done, and they're about 3 funerals away, maybe from all of them saying, not the synod, but them saying, we can't do this anymore. They have a piece of property that's worth about $500,000. And I think, just like a wealthy aunt or uncle who sits down and looks at their estate and says, where do we want this to go? And I think you will see us bless ministries in that way. Now that's kind of happening in the synod right now. I'm looking at time, okay. Of course, I don't have to get there till the sermon, do I? There were 2 churches in Waukesha sold. St. Andrews, that was built on a subdivision that was supposed to open that never quite developed the way they thought. They'd been through 30 years of kind of having the synod give them money and trying to restart, and then it started to bloom, and then it fallen. So there were about 20 people left worshiping. They sold that, And then Good Shepherd also had about 40 people, and they, by the way, the Synod doesn't direct these, they decided it was time. And so when St. Andrews was sold, they paid off the debt at Good Shepherd. When Good Shepherd was sold, there was $430,000 left when all was settled. So that's in the Mission Investment Fund. It did come to the Synod, but I went to our Synod Council and I said, you know, we could plug $10,000 holes, 43 of them, and we could do that by 2 o'clock this afternoon. Could you find use for $10,000 if I, yeah, he's, yeah. And I said, let's challenge the Synod to say, what should we do with this money that would further the kingdom? And so it's been an exciting journey. We are now, there's a committee that's looking at various proposals. I appointed the committee and I looked for people who had wonderful heart for the church and who didn't have a dog in the race. Okay, so just people who would look as objectively as they could. Well, we received by September 15th 35 proposals totaling $4.9 million in requests. So now you have this committee that's trying to say, okay, how are we going to spend $430,000 for these wonderful requests? And most of them really are worth looking at. And what that's done is first put a lot of pressure on the committee. We've all decided we're leaving the Synod as soon as any decision is made. But it's also generated a discussion within our congregation saying, wow, what can we do that makes a difference? And my hope and prayer is that the discussion is bigger than the money itself. That from all these tremendous ideas that have come forward, when all is said and done, we'll look at all those proposals and say, you know, there's about 6 of them that need to be funded. How are we as a church going to do that? And so that's what I'd like to see us do with some of those properties. I suspect there will be some that are sold in the next few years. We just have some parishes that have come to the end of their life, and I always leave it open for the Holy Spirit to make a dramatic shift. But I think it's going to happen. I have 2 questions here.
What emphasis in peace and justice areas is the Synod working on? I know food security is one that you've been personally involved in, and could you speak on those?
Yeah, and I'll have to give you the abridged answer. First of all, based on a program that Elise and Kari Stein and I went to, and then we're joined by Gretchen and others and Lorna in ecumenical advocacy days, we realized that food ties almost every ministry in our Synod together. So our Synod assembly is going to be around food justice. So that's one thing we've done. The other, you know Joe Ellwanger, I'm guessing? Oh, yeah. He never asked me to do anything that I don't do. He has a track record. And so I think we try to stay in touch with the anti-racism committee that has a big voice. We have a Reconciling Christ committee that has a big voice. But I think more and more as we deal with areas of poverty in our Synod, that a tremendous amount of the Synod staff's time and energy goes to those things. I wish I could say we were like the success story of the world. You know, it's a harder process, but certainly that's where a lot of my heart is. So, thank you. I realize we're running out of time, but
would you briefly comment on the ads that have been running in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and maybe other newspapers too? Half-page color ads on the mission investment funds. Sunday paper, A section.
on the ELCA's Mission Investment Fund?
Yeah.
Wow.
For maybe 8 Sundays, not today's paper. but last Sunday and a number of Sundays, half page below the fold, A section, color ads. They featured, is it Grace Lutheran Church in Menominee Falls?
Let's see, how many are aware of these ads?
Don't you guys read the paper?
Maybe they're donated, you know? Maybe it's in kind.
Oh, half page below the fold, color.
No. Yeah, it is.
Go
I do read the paper. James White got 125 yards rushing yesterday.
Wrong section.
I will look,
It's a mission investment fund.
was it an ad that was put
It's an
out?
ad.
I will track down and find out where that came from. The Mission
I find it
Investment Fund.
Very interesting. I hope it's
Um,
good cause.
There is one area that our church has been a little slow in, and that's estate planning gifts. It may have come through the national church, and Larry Westfield's in our local area. It may have come through a private party who wanted to make this known, because that's one transfer of wealth that's going to happen over the next years, and I think there are some tremendous missions that can be funded through that. So there's a group in our Synod that are working on a Synod endowment fund, but it's the Lutheran Office on Planned Giving. May have come through that, but I wasn't aware that it was in the paper.
It's a great place to put your money.
Yeah, it is, and I think, have you ever had Larry to one of these things? I think you would love him. He was a wonderful pastor in our Synod, and he is really wonderful at talking about our estate planning as one of the key things that will underwrite the future of our churches. And he does it with a great sensitivity that it's not, this is my little bailiwick you gotta fill. So he's in discussions with the Tanzania Committee, with Outreach for Hope, with all these wonderful committees that, and to say they're all part of the same family, folks. So, thank you. I could take one or two more and then we better.
Well, I would just like to say that I appreciate the sensitivity that you're employing with the church issues, the number of churches in various areas, and that you were talking about your lead on leadership, how to be leaders and what to do for congregations. I like that you're creating a new creation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Because that's what we're called to do.
Well, thank you.
So with death, there's new life, and we have a conversation about that.
Well, there is, and it's things like, at Holy Communion, Walter Hermans and I, as pastors, we used to sit around coffee and say, we'll merge with any church in Racine, as long as it's our building and our staff. That's where most of us start, frankly. But then there are a couple things. I saw that Roman Catholic churches in the city merged 5 churches, and the bishop can do that in the Roman Catholic. It's up to the congregations here. But I realized that they waited much too long to where almost all those 5 congregations were practically dead in the water before anybody raised the question. The other thing that was a real eye-opener for me was one year we had a preschool, and so we were required to plow every time there's a certain amount of snow. We racked up a nice $20,000 snow plowing bill. We absorbed that, thankfully, but I looked at all of those 10 churches in West Racine. Many of the smaller churches had $5,000 to $10,000 in snow plowing, and we were all sitting probably using a third of our space. And you think somebody's just got to talk about some basic stewardship as to how we do things. So that's what initiates the discussion and says it's time that we can't just keep all these 57 Buicks running pretty as they are. So thank you so much for the time today. I'm just really grateful to be here. Again, I just love this church. I've gotten to know a number of people now, and I want you to keep doing what you're doing because it sets a great pace for the rest of us. God bless you. Thanks.